Their home always smelled of freshly brewed tea and incense. Alice loved this scent. It created a special atmosphere of comfort and tranquility that her students enjoyed so much. The small yoga studio was located on the first floor of the two-story house, where she and Grayson had lived for the past 3 years. The second floor was their apartment, spacious with panoramic windows and minimalist decor. This January morning began as usual. Alice woke up at 6, drank a glass of warm water with lemon, and went down to the studio. She had an hour before her first class, time for her own practice. She turned on the dim lights, lit a few candles, and spread out her yoga mat. She could hear muffled sounds from upstairs. Grayson was getting ready for work. He always left early. The nature of medical equipment sales required meeting with clients at their convenience. Alice heard her husband coming down the stairs, his footsteps fading at the studio door. "Good morning." Grayson peeked through the half-open door, tall, fit in an impeccably pressed suit. "I'll be late today. Important meeting with potential clients." "Okay." Alice smiled without interrupting her practice. It was familiar. His late returns, meetings, business trips. In 5 years of marriage, she had learned to live with this rhythm. Her day was scheduled down to the minute. Morning classes for beginners, then a group of advanced students, individual consultations. Alice loved her work. Helping people find balance and harmony through yoga was her calling. By evening, when the last student had left the studio, Alice went up to her apartment. On the kitchen table was a vase with a bouquet of white lilies. The note read, "Sorry I'm so late. I love you." Grayson often surprised her with gifts like this, especially when he was out late. She put the kettle on and took out her favorite mug, a hand-painted ceramic cup. It was a gift from Grayson from their first trip to Japan together. Back then, 4 years ago, they had talked a lot about the future, about how they would build their house, how they would travel, how they would have children one day. Her phone vibrated, a message from her friend Rachel. "Saw your husband today at a cafe on 5th Avenue. He wasn't alone, he was with some girl, looks like a business meeting." Alice put her phone down without replying. Of course, it was a business meeting. Half of Grayson's clients were female doctors. It was normal, but for some reason, for the first time in a long time, she felt a slight uneasiness. Grayson came home around 10 that evening. He smelled of his favorite cologne and a little alcohol. "Sorry, honey, the clients insisted on dinner after signing the contract." "It's okay," Alice replied, continuing to read her book. "How was the meeting?" "Great. We signed a contract for the delivery of new equipment. It's a big deal." He leaned over to kiss her on the cheek. "I'm going to take a shower and go to bed. I'm exhausted." Alice watched her husband disappear into the bathroom. Something had changed, but she couldn't put her finger on it. Maybe it was because he always used to tell her about his meetings in detail? Or was it because he never used to go straight to the shower when he came home? She closed the book. Rachel's message kept running through her mind. 5th Avenue was on the opposite side of town from Grayson's main client's offices. What was he doing there? As she fell asleep, Alice convinced herself that there was a logical explanation for everything. They had a good marriage. They loved each other. Her suspicions were just fatigue and an overactive imagination. Tomorrow would be a new day and everything would fall back into place. Spring had been surprisingly warm that year. Alice had gotten into the habit of doing her morning yoga in the garden as there was enough space around the house to lay out a few mats under an old apple tree. The students loved practicing in the fresh air. On one such day, Grayson unexpectedly returned home in the middle of the day. He waited for the class to end, patiently watching from the sidelines. When the last student left, he approached his wife with a mysterious smile. "I have a surprise for you," Grayson said, handing Alice a glossy brochure. "Remember you said you wanted to deepen your knowledge of yoga? I found some amazing courses. The teacher is from India, a real guru." Alice took the brochure skeptically. The courses did look impressive. A 2-week program with a renowned master, including not only asana practice, but also an in-depth study of yoga philosophy. "But that's in another city," she remarked, flipping through the pages. "It's only a 3-hour drive. I've thought it all through. Maggie can run the studio temporarily. She's wanted to try her hand at teaching for a long time. And you'll finally be able to focus completely on your development." Her husband's concern touched Alice, although the offer seemed a little unexpected. Grayson had never been particularly interested in her professional growth before. He respected her passion for yoga, but saw it more as a hobby than a serious career. "That's very sweet of you, but the course starts in 2 weeks. I won't have time to get the studio ready before I leave." "I'll help you with all the arrangements." Grayson was unusually insistent. "All you have to do is pack your things and go. I'll take care of everything else." Over the next few days, Grayson showed remarkable care. He arranged a replacement for Maggie himself, drew up a class schedule, and even prepared the paperwork for the temporary transfer of duties. His enthusiasm was contagious, and Alice began to gradually warm up to the idea of the upcoming trip. In the evenings, they often discussed the details of the courses. Grayson listened attentively to her thoughts on different types of yoga and asked questions about the philosophy and practice. This was unusual. He hadn't been very interested in these topics before. "You know, maybe after these courses you could take some more training," he remarked one evening over dinner. "In India, for example, I've heard there are some amazing schools there." Alice looked at her husband in surprise. "But you always said you didn't want me to go away for long." "People change," Grayson shrugged. "I've realized that I shouldn't hold you back. You're a talented teacher. You need to grow." His voice sounded sincere, but something about the situation seemed wrong to Alice. It was as if her husband's sudden enthusiasm was hiding something else that she couldn't quite put her finger on. One morning, she found Grayson studying the websites of various yoga schools. He looked so absorbed in what he was doing that he didn't even notice her presence. The screen was filled with pages advertising courses in different countries: India, Thailand, Nepal. "You've become an expert on yoga tours," Alice remarked, and Grayson flinched slightly, quickly closing his laptop. "I just want to keep up with your interests," he replied, quickly kissing her on the cheek. "By the way, I found some more interesting courses. Next month, in a neighboring state." Alice listened to him talk about new learning opportunities, and a strange feeling grew inside her. Her husband's concern seemed excessive, almost obsessive. It was as if he was trying to send her away from home by any means necessary. But she diligently pushed these thoughts away. After all, was it so bad that her husband was so supportive of her professional development? Many of her friends could only dream of such support from their spouses. A week later, Alice agreed to go on the 2-week course. Grayson looked unusually pleased when she told him her decision. That evening, he bought a bottle of expensive wine and cooked dinner, the first time he had done so in a long time. The 2-week course changed a lot in Alice's life. She returned home inspired by her new knowledge and full of ideas for developing the studio. Grayson met her at the station with a bouquet of her favorite lilies and asked her about her trip, but he seemed a little distracted. That evening, Alice noticed the first oddity. During dinner, her husband's phone vibrated several times, but he didn't even glance at the screen. Grayson always checked his messages, saying it might be something urgent for work. But now the phone was lying face down, and Grayson was trying hard not to notice the notifications. Gradually, life returned to normal. Alice taught classes at the studio, incorporating new techniques she had learned in her courses. Grayson, as usual, disappeared at work, only now his tardiness became more frequent and his explanations vague. One evening, when her husband was late again, Alice decided to make his favorite mushroom risotto. She reached into the kitchen cabinet for the special rice they always kept for this dish and accidentally found a receipt from a restaurant. The date was 3 days ago, the time was midday, and the amount was for 2 people. That day, Grayson had said he had meetings at the office all day. Alice put the receipt back where she found it. Perhaps it was a business meeting with a client. But then why hadn't her husband mentioned it? He always told her about such meetings and often even asked her advice on how to conduct the negotiations. One morning, as Grayson was getting ready for work, a business card fell out of his jacket pocket. It had a woman's name and the title Clinic Administrator. Alice returned the card to her husband, who hastily put it back in his pocket, muttering something about a new potential client. The phone calls became increasingly strange. Grayson began to go into another room to talk, although he had previously discussed work matters calmly in front of his wife. Now his voice became quieter when the phone rang, and once Alice accidentally overheard the end of a conversation. "No, I can't today. She's home." His appearance also changed. Grayson had always taken care of himself, but now he began to pay special attention to his appearance. He bought several new suits and started going to the gym more often. Once, Alice noticed an unfamiliar scent of cologne on his shirt, not the one he usually wore. On those rare evenings when they had dinner together, Grayson continued to talk about new opportunities for Alice's education. Now he was insisting that she consider long-term courses in other countries. "You need to develop yourself, dear. Don't limit yourself to just the local studio." His words sounded caring, but something in his tone seemed insincere. It was as if he were reading a script he had memorized, without putting any real emotion into it. One day, Alice decided to drop by her husband's office with lunch. She had done this before. The secretary raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Grayson is working remotely today, didn't he tell you?" But he had left for work as usual that morning, wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase. That evening, Grayson came home with a folder of documents, talking about a hard day at the office and difficult negotiations. Alice listened to his story, mechanically stirring her tea. The spoon clinked softly against the sides of the cup, the same Japanese cup, hand-painted. At dinner, Grayson brought up the subject of the courses in India again. He spoke enthusiastically, showing photos of the ashram on his phone. In the middle of his story, he received a message and quickly swiped the notification away. But Alice managed to catch the sender's name, the same as on the business card. Alice couldn't sleep for a long time that night. Grayson was breathing steadily beside her, while she stared at the ceiling and thought about how strangely their lives had changed recently. Each little thing seemed insignificant on its own, but together they formed an unpleasant picture, the meaning of which she could not or did not want to understand. After a 2-week course, Alice began to give extra lessons in the evenings. It distracted her from intrusive thoughts and disturbing observations. One evening, when she stayed late at the studio to discuss a student's progress, Grayson unexpectedly returned home. "Why didn't you tell me you had a class?" His voice sounded irritated. "I came home early on purpose to spend the evening with you." Alice looked at her husband in surprise. "I always have extra classes on Tuesdays, and you usually come home much later. So I have to adjust my schedule to fit your classes?" Grayson shook his head. "You know, sometimes I feel like your work is more important to you than your family." These words caught Alice off guard. Her husband had never accused her of being overly devoted to her work before. On the contrary, he had always supported her and was proud of her successes. What had changed? The next day, Grayson came home with a huge bouquet of roses and tickets to the theater. "I'm sorry about yesterday," he said, hugging his wife. "I just missed you so much. We haven't spent much time together lately." The evening at the theater was wonderful. They hadn't gone out together in a long time, and Alice had almost forgotten how attentive and caring her husband could be. After the show, they walked around the city late into the night, talking about trivial things and laughing. All her doubts seemed far-fetched and ridiculous. But after a few days, Grayson became distant again. Now he hardly touched his phone in her presence, but talked on it for a long time in the car before entering the house. When Alice asked him about work, he answered in monosyllables or changed the subject. "Maybe we should go out of town for the weekend," Alice suggested one day. "Like we used to." "I'm sorry, honey, but I can't this weekend," Grayson smiled guiltily. "I have an important presentation on Monday and I need to prepare. But you know what? I've been looking at training programs in India." And again, the conversation turned to her professional development. Grayson spoke enthusiastically, made plans, and talked about wonderful opportunities. At moments like these, he became his old self, loving, attentive, and interested. One evening, Alice overheard him on the phone. "No, this weekend won't work. Yes, she suspects something. We need to be more careful." When she entered the room, Grayson quickly ended the conversation and immediately offered to order her favorite pizza. After that incident, he became even more attentive and caring. He made breakfast, asked about her plans, and helped her in the studio. But this concern seemed exaggerated, fake. It was as if Grayson was playing the role of the perfect husband. "You seem tense lately," he remarked one evening at dinner. "Maybe you need a break? I can arrange a trip. Why are you so insistent on sending me away?" Alice couldn't hold back. Grayson looked at her with genuine surprise. "I'm just looking out for you. Is that so wrong? Or don't you trust me anymore?" There was a hint of hurt in his voice, and Alice felt guilty. Indeed, how could she blame someone for caring too much? Maybe all her suspicions were just the result of fatigue and paranoia. That evening, Grayson was especially tender. He talked about his plans for their future together and recalled funny moments from their first dates. Alice almost believed that everything was fine, that she was really overreacting. But then, in the middle of the night, she woke up to the sound of messages being typed. Grayson, thinking she was asleep, was texting someone, covering his phone screen with a blanket. In the middle of summer, Grayson came home earlier than usual, clearly excited and happy. Alice was just finishing her evening class at the studio when he came down with his laptop in his hands. "I have amazing news," he began, waiting for the last student to leave the studio. "Remember I told you about a possible contract with an Indian company? They're ready to work with us, but they want to meet in person. And you know what? I thought, why don't we go together?" He opened his laptop, showing her photos of a luxurious ashram near Mumbai. "Look, while I'm busy with negotiations, you can practice yoga with real masters. I've already checked it out. It's an amazing school, with people from all over the world studying there." Alice silently looked at the photos. The place really did look impressive. Old buildings surrounded by greenery, spacious classrooms, and the peaceful atmosphere of an ancient culture. "I know what you're thinking," Grayson continued. "The studio, the students. But we can arrange everything. Maggie will definitely be able to handle it. She did a great job last time. Besides, it's only for 3 weeks." "3 weeks?" Alice asked. "But you've never been away on a business trip for more than a week. This is a special case. Important negotiations, getting to know the production process, signing contracts, and you need time to really immerse yourself in the practice." Over the next few days, Grayson enthusiastically set about organizing the trip. He booked tickets, reserved a hotel in Mumbai for the first few days, and arranged a place at the ashram. His enthusiasm was contagious, and Alice gradually began to warm to the idea of the trip. "Imagine morning practice at sunrise, meditation in an ancient temple," he said over dinner. "And on the weekends, when I don't have meetings, we can explore the city together and get to know the local culture." Alice got busy preparing her studio for her departure. She made a schedule for Maggie, assigned students, and wrote recommendations for each group. The work helped her take her mind off the strange feeling that had been with her ever since Grayson had suggested the trip. A week before their departure, they had a farewell dinner with friends. Grayson was in high spirits, talking about the prospects of working with an Indian company and sharing his plans for the future. Alice watched her husband and noticed how confidently he spoke about the details of the upcoming negotiations while avoiding specifics. Rachel's friend stayed after dinner to help clear the table. "You seem worried," she remarked when they were alone in the kitchen. "Is everything okay?" "Of course," Alice tried to smile. "I'm just nervous about the long trip." The remaining days flew by in pre-departure bustle. Grayson dealt with paperwork, called partners, and prepared presentations. Alice packed her things, taught her last classes, and said goodbye to her students. The day before her departure, she happened to overhear her husband talking on the phone in the garden. "Yes, everything is going according to plan. 3 weeks will be enough. No, she doesn't suspect anything." Noticing Alice, he quickly ended the conversation, saying that it was a colleague asking about the details of the trip. At the airport, Grayson was unusually quiet. He answered questions distractedly and constantly checked his phone. When their flight was called, he suddenly remembered, "Damn, I forgot to buy water. Please go to that store and I'll keep an eye on the luggage." Alice headed for the store but suddenly stopped and turned around. Grayson was quickly typing something on his phone, and a strange, unfamiliar smile appeared on his face. The first few days in Mumbai passed in a blur, acclimatization, getting to know the city, Grayson's endless phone calls to his partners. They stayed at a modern hotel in the business district. In the mornings, Alice did yoga in her room while her husband got ready for meetings. On the 4th day of their stay, Grayson announced that he had to go to a production facility in the suburbs. "It will take all day. Why don't you go on a tour? I've arranged for a guide to show you the temples and markets." The day was fascinating. Alice soaked up new impressions, photographed colorful streets, and sampled the local cuisine. When she returned to the hotel in the evening, her husband was not in the room, but she wasn't worried. He often stayed late for meetings. Later that night, Grayson returned tired but satisfied. "Tomorrow is an important day," he said as he took a shower. "I need to go to the head office to sign some preliminary documents." In the morning, they had breakfast together at the hotel restaurant. Grayson was unusually quiet and kept glancing at his watch. "Listen," he said finally, "I need you to give me your passport. It's for some local paperwork. I'm not sure what, but it's a requirement." Alice took her passport out of her purse. "And you should leave your money with me too," her husband added. "You know how they are with tourists here. I'll keep it in my briefcase. It'll be safer." After breakfast, Grayson left, promising to return for dinner. Alice spent the morning by the pool, trying to cope with a strange feeling of unease. Her husband didn't show up for lunch. He didn't answer his phone or text messages. By evening, Alice began to panic. She went down to the reception desk to try to find out anything about her husband. The clerk smiled politely and informed her that Mr. Page had checked out of the hotel around noon. In the room, Alice discovered that all of her husband's belongings were gone. His toothbrush, razor, laptop, everything was gone. Only her things remained in the closet. She began checking the drawers until she found an envelope with a short note. "I'm sorry. This is for the best. Don't try to find me. I'll transfer the money for your ticket home in a week." Alice reread the note over and over, trying to comprehend what was happening. Her phone was dead and the charger was in Grayson's briefcase. He had also taken her credit cards, supposedly for security reasons. There was only a little cash left in her purse, enough for a couple of days. Alice tried to call the American embassy from the phone at the reception desk, but it was late in the evening and the office was closed. She spent the night awake, sitting in a chair and staring at the lights of the city outside the window. For the first time in her life, she found herself completely alone in a foreign country, without money or documents. All the strange behavior of her husband over the past few months suddenly made sense. In the morning, she went down to the reception desk again. Now there was a different girl behind the counter who told her more bad news. The room had only been paid for until noon. Alice tried to explain the situation, but was met with polite indifference. After packing her things into a suitcase, she settled in the hotel lobby trying to come up with a plan. Her last money was going to food and water. Her phone was still silent. Grayson had blocked her number. Fragments of conversations from the last few months were spinning in her head. His insistent desire to send her away somewhere far away. The strange phone calls. His sudden concern for her future. It had all been leading up to this day. By evening, the hotel management began to hint that it was time for her to leave the lobby. Alice stepped outside, feeling completely lost in the noisy, hot city. She remembered the embassy's address, but without money, even a taxi would be difficult to get there. Sitting in a small cafe where she bought tea with her last rupees, Alice considered her options. Call her friends? But how, with a dead phone? Go to the police? The local law enforcement agencies were unlikely to want to get involved in the family problems of foreigners. Time passed differently in a small hotel on the outskirts of Mumbai. Alice woke up early in the morning to the noise of the street and lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, trying to collect her thoughts. Cars honked outside the window, vendors shouted, and temple bells rang in the distance. The first thing she needed to do was find a way to charge her phone. She saw a power outlet in the hotel lobby, but her adapter was in Grayson's briefcase. The hotel owner, an elderly Indian man with kind eyes, noticed her predicament and brought her an old charger. When her phone finally turned on, it exploded with dozens of notifications. Messages from students, calls from Maggie, Rachel's concerned questions. Grayson's number was blocked. The embassy didn't take her right away. She had to sit in line for several hours, explaining her situation to each new employee. Finally, a young diplomat named Jason listened to her. "Unfortunately, we can't issue a new passport without confirming your identity," he explained. "We need some documents, photos, certified copies. Can you contact someone at home who could help?" Alice called Rachel. Her friend was horrified by what had happened and immediately offered to help. "I'll contact his parents. They should know what's going on, and I'll find your documents at the studio." The next few days turned into an endless bureaucratic merry-go-round. Alice shuttled between the embassy, the local police, and the Western Union, where Grayson had promised to transfer the money. Every time she returned to her small room, she checked her phone for news from her husband. The money was melting away rapidly. A cheap hotel, simple meals in street cafes, public transportation. Even so, she only had enough cash left for a couple of days. The Western Union was silent, and Grayson was not in touch. On the fourth day, Rachel called. "His parents are in shock. They say they don't know where he is. But I found copies of your documents in the studio and sent them to the embassy." The hotel owner, Mr. Patel, noticing her depressed state, began bringing her Indian tea and flatbread in the mornings. His wife, a small woman in a bright sari, tried to comfort her in a mixture of Hindi and English. The process at the embassy was slow. More and more confirmations, references, and statements were required. Jason tried to help, but the bureaucratic machine worked according to its own rules. "Listen," he said one day, staying behind after work. "There is an emergency procedure for issuing a temporary passport. It's more expensive and complicated, but faster. I can help with the paperwork." Alice agreed. The problem of money remained. A temporary passport was not cheap. She called her parents, who immediately sent the necessary amount. In the evenings, she sat on the roof of the hotel, watching the sun set over Mumbai. The city no longer seemed so foreign and hostile. The people here were kinder than she had expected. The saleswoman at the neighboring shop treated her to fruit, and an elderly neighbor helped her translate when she had to communicate with the local authorities. Mr. Patel introduced her to his daughter, who worked at a travel agency. The girl helped her book a ticket home at the lowest price as soon as her passport arrived. On the seventh day, a message arrived from Grayson, short and to the point. "The money has been transferred. I hope you're okay." Alice stared at the words for a long time but didn't reply. Inside there was only emptiness, no anger, no resentment, as if the message had been written by a complete stranger. The temporary passport was ready 2 days later. Jason personally brought the documents to the hotel. "Take care of yourself," he said goodbye. "And sometimes the hardest trials make us stronger." Packing her things for the trip, Alice found her Japanese cup in her suitcase pocket. She had put it there mechanically when she was packing at the hotel. The cup had cracked during transport. Alice wrapped it in a scarf and put it back in her suitcase. Cracked, but not broken. It seemed important for some reason. The long flight with 2 layovers exhausted Alice completely. Rachel met her at the New York airport, gave her a big hug, and took her home. "You need to rest, calm down," her friend said. But Alice shook her head. She knew she wouldn't be able to relax until she saw everything with her own eyes. The taxi stopped outside their house an hour later. All the windows were dark except for the studio, where the evening class must have been in progress. Alice took out her keys. The lock clicked as usual, as if nothing had changed. The house smelled different. Instead of the familiar incense, there was a sweet floral scent. There was an unfamiliar vase with orchids in the living room. On the coffee table were glasses and an empty wine bottle. Alice climbed the stairs, trying to tread quietly. Muffled voices and laughter came from the bedroom. She stood at the door, gathering her courage, then knocked decisively. The voices fell silent. She heard hurried footsteps and the door swung open. Grayson froze in the doorway, his face white as a sheet. Behind him, she caught a glimpse of a woman hurriedly pulling on a dress. "Alice?" He said her name as if he had seen a ghost. You shouldn't have come back?" She was surprised at how calm her voice sounded. "To my own home?" A young woman peered out from behind Grayson's shoulder, the same one from the business card. Her blonde hair was tousled, her lipstick smeared. She glanced fearfully from Alice to Grayson. "Wendy, you should leave." Grayson finally found his voice. "No, stay." Alice walked past them into the bedroom. "I'll just grab a few things." The room looked unfamiliar. There were traces of someone else's makeup on her pillow. There were unfamiliar clothes in the closet. On the bedside table was a photograph of Grayson hugging a blonde girl. Alice methodically gathered her things into a bag: toothbrush, comb, favorite sweater, documents from the desk drawer. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw Wendy hurriedly pulling on her shoes and grabbing her purse. "Alice, let's talk." Grayson blocked her way to the door. "I can explain everything." "Really?" She looked him in the eyes. "And what exactly are you going to explain? How you plan to get rid of me? How you deliberately took me to India and left me there without money or documents?" Wendy froze in the doorway, her eyes wide with surprise. It seemed she didn't know this part of the story. "I was going to transfer the money," Grayson stammered. "I did transfer it. A week later, after I spent the night in a cheap hotel and begged at the embassy." Alice glanced around the bedroom, their bedroom, where they had spent so many happy moments, where they had made plans for the future, where they had woken up together in the mornings. "I'll get the rest of my things later," she said, heading for the door. "And yes, Grayson, don't worry about the divorce. I'll take care of everything." Downstairs, the front door slammed shut. Wendy had run away. Alice descended the stairs, feeling her husband's gaze on her back. Her ex-husband. The class was still in session in the studio. Maggie's voice, calm and confident, could be heard through the slightly ajar door. Alice listened for a moment to the familiar instructions and the measured breathing of the students. Stepping outside, she took a deep breath of the cool evening air. She took out her phone and dialed Rachel's number. "Can I stay with you for a few days?" "Of course," her friend's voice sounded relieved. "I'll be right over." Alice spent the first few days after her return at Rachel's house, trying to collect her thoughts. Her friend lived in a small apartment in Brooklyn, worked as an editor at a publishing house, and often stayed late working on manuscripts. This gave Alice a chance to be alone, to sort out her feelings and what had happened. Rachel was the first to notice something wrong with Grayson's behavior. Now that the betrayal was clear, she told Alice about the little things that had seemed insignificant before. "Remember that night at the restaurant, about 4 months ago?" Rachel said over a cup of herbal tea. "When I told you I saw Grayson with some girl." He explained so convincingly that it was a business meeting with a representative from the clinic. Alice remembered. At the time, she had even scolded her friend for being suspicious. Grayson had seemed so sincere when he told her about the important contract. Gradually, other details began to surface. Maggie, who was temporarily teaching at the studio, said that Grayson had become interested in the yoga school's affairs long before his trip to India. He asked about income, the possibility of selling the business, and whether she could handle the management. "It was like he was testing the waters," Maggie said thoughtfully. "He wondered if the studio could operate without you. I thought he was just concerned about the business." Alice learned even more disturbing details from Grayson's parents. It turned out that a few months before his trip to India, he had borrowed a large sum of money from them. He said he wanted to invest in expanding the business and open a new yoga studio for Alice. "We had no idea," his mother cried on the phone. "He always knew how to convince people, even us, his own parents." Through mutual acquaintances, Alice found out that Wendy had been working at the clinic for over a year. Grayson met her during another medical equipment presentation. The young administrator had long dreamed of starting her own business, and Grayson courted her beautifully, promising to help her open a clinic. Gradually, the whole picture came together. Grayson had been laying the groundwork for his disappearance for several months. He had been keeping an eye on the studio's affairs, building a relationship with Wendy and borrowing money under various pretexts. The story about his Indian partners turned out to be completely fabricated. There were no contracts, no negotiations. One morning, an unfamiliar woman called. She introduced herself as Linda and said she had worked with Grayson last year. "I have something to tell you." The voice on the phone sounded agitated. "I saw your story in the news and realized I couldn't keep quiet." They met in a small cafe. Linda turned out to be a tired middle-aged woman who worked in the sales department of the same company as Grayson. "He tried a similar scheme before," she said. "With another woman, a year ago. He courted her beautifully, promised to help her with her business. But it didn't work out. Her friends suspected something and made a fuss." Alice listened, mechanically stirring her cold coffee. The story seemed both unfamiliar and frighteningly familiar. Each new piece of information added details to the portrait of the man she had lived with for 5 years. That evening, she received a message from Wendy. It turned out she didn't know much either. Grayson had told her a completely different version of their marriage, that they had decided to separate long ago and that Alice herself wanted to start a new life in India. "I was such a fool," Wendy wrote. "I believed in a fairy tale about a noble man who helps his wife start a new life while suffering from loneliness himself. I'm sorry." Alice found a letter from the bank in her mailbox. It turned out that Grayson had withdrawn almost all the money from their joint account the day before leaving for India. He had deposited it into a new account opened in his name. Friends told her about strange phone calls and meetings they had witnessed. It was like a puzzle coming together, where every piece had its own meaning. All his late returns, business trips, sudden concern for her development. It was all part of a carefully thought-out plan. Rachel, after listening to another round of revelations, shook her head. You know what's the scariest thing? He really thought everything through, every little detail. If you hadn't been able to come back so quickly. But Alice wasn't listening anymore. For the first time in a long time, the yoga studio was empty and quiet. Alice had come here early in the morning before the first students arrived. She sat down on her mat and crossed her legs in the lotus position as usual. But instead of her usual meditation, fragments of conversations, phone calls, and messages were spinning around in her head. The news of what had happened spread quickly. The students divided into two camps. Some sent letters of support, while others delicately canceled their classes. Maggie tried to keep her usual schedule, but many were not ready to study with a substitute. Only 3 regular students showed up for the first morning class. They studiously avoided looking her in the eye and greeted her awkwardly. Unspoken sympathy hung in the air. Neighbors, accustomed to seeing them as a model couple, now cast curious glances. Mrs. Baker, who lived across the street, demonstratively crossed to the other side of the street when she saw Alice. Mr. Rodriguez, the owner of a local coffee shop, on the other hand, brought her fresh pastries and invited her to stop by any time. Rachel insisted that Alice move in with her temporarily. "You need a change of scenery," her friend said. "Besides, I don't trust Grayson. Who knows what else he might do?" Grayson's parents called the day after Alice returned. His mother cried into the phone. His father spoke dryly and formally. They offered to help with money, but Alice refused. The bank was sympathetic to her story, but threw up their hands. Grayson had every right to dispose of the joint account. A young manager advised her to consult a lawyer. The phone wouldn't stop ringing. Former classmates, casual acquaintances, even long-forgotten friends, everyone suddenly decided to remind her of their existence. Some were genuinely sympathetic, others just wanted details. Grayson didn't show up or call. Through his lawyer, he sent some papers related to the division of property. Alice didn't even bother to read them. She couldn't think about it yet. Wendy had also disappeared. According to her colleagues at the clinic, she had taken a leave of absence and left town. No one knew where. Maggie reported that some regular clients had canceled their memberships. The studio's income had plummeted, and the rent bills hadn't been canceled. Something had to be done urgently. In the evenings, Rachel Alice sat on the small balcony of her apartment and looked out at the city. Below, life was bustling as usual. People were rushing about their business, laughing, arguing, hurrying somewhere. Her own life was frozen as if on pause, and she didn't yet know how to press play. Rachel's apartment was cozy, but too small for 2. Alice knew she couldn't sleep on the living room couch forever while her friend delicately tried not to disturb her in the mornings as she got ready for work. The first thing Alice did was make an appointment with a lawyer recommended by her bank manager. The lawyer, a middle-aged woman named Judith Graham, listened attentively to her story. "Let's take it step by step," Judith said, opening her notebook. "First, you need to file for divorce and obtain a temporary restraining order on any transactions involving jointly acquired property. Given the circumstances, we can seek compensation for your expenses in India." After meeting with the lawyer, Alice went to the studio. Maggie showed her the financial reports for the last month. The situation wasn't great, but it wasn't catastrophic either. "I can continue running the basic groups," Maggie offered, "and you'll focus on individual lessons and advanced students. They're all asking about you." Alice nodded. She would have to deal with problems as they arose. She drew up a new schedule, wrote letters to her regular students, and updated the studio's website. The next step was to find a place to live. Rachel offered to let her stay with her, but Alice knew she needed her own space. She found a small apartment not far from the studio that she could rent for a few months. When she arrived to collect her things from their former home, Grayson was not there. His clothes were gone from the closet, along with his books and his favorite coffee maker. On the kitchen table was a letter from his lawyer proposing a division of property. Alice methodically gathered her belongings, documents, and photographs. Then she sat down and wrote 2 letters. The first was to the bank, demanding that all transactions on joint accounts be blocked. The second was to the real estate agent to find out the real value of the house. In the evening, Grayson's mother called. For the first time in all this time, Alice spoke to her calmly and firmly. "I appreciate your offer of help," she said, "but right now, I need to deal with this on my own. And yes, I'm filing for divorce." The next day, Alice opened a new bank account and transferred her personal savings there. Then she met with an accountant to sort out the studio's taxes and financial documents. Judith helped her draft a formal demand to Grayson for compensation for the expenses incurred as a result of his deception. Alice signed the papers, trying not to think about how just a few weeks ago she and her husband had been planning a future together. The new apartment was empty and unfamiliar, but it was her territory. Alice bought a few houseplants, hung up her favorite photos, and laid out a yoga mat by the window. Maggie told her that several former students had returned to the studio. What's more, Alice's story had somehow attracted new clients, mostly women going through difficult times in their lives. By the end of the week, Alice had a clear plan of action. First, stabilize the studio. Second, finalize the divorce. Third, resolve the issue with the house she and Grayson had bought together. She made changes to the studio's advertising, adding new services. In addition to the usual yoga classes, she now offered stress management and emotional trauma recovery classes. In the evening, after finishing her paperwork, Alice felt a sense of calm for the first time in a long time. She had a plan, she had people willing to help, and most importantly, she was determined to move forward. Her first meeting with Grayson after returning from India took place in the mediator's office. Alice followed her lawyer in and was surprised to see how much her husband had changed. He looked haggard and nervous, and there was no trace of his usual confidence. "Let's discuss the possibilities for an amicable settlement," suggested the mediator, who introduced herself as Mrs. Donovan. Grayson suddenly exploded. "What amicable settlement? She ruined all my plans by coming back early. I lost a big client because of this scandal." Judith calmly opened a folder with documents. "My client is demanding compensation for her living expenses in India, the restoration of her documents, and her return home. We also insist on a fair division of the property acquired jointly." "Fair?" Grayson laughed. "What about the fact that I've always provided for the family? The yoga studio is a hobby, not a business." Alice silently took out the studio's financial reports for the last 3 years. The numbers spoke for themselves. Her hobby brought in a steady income. After 2 hours of fruitless negotiations, it became clear that there would be no amicable solution. Grayson refused to admit his guilt and demanded that the house be sold and the money divided in his favor. The next day, Alice discovered that she couldn't access her email. The password had been changed. Then it turned out that Grayson had managed to withdraw money from their joint account the day before the hearing. "He's trying to pressure you," Judith explained. "It's a typical tactic, but we'll file an additional claim for unauthorized use of joint funds." Grayson started spreading rumors. Alice heard stories about how she had allegedly run away to India with another man and was now trying to sue her innocent husband for money. During the second hearing, Grayson arrived with Wendy. She sat in the courtroom hallway, demonstratively holding his hand. Alice was struck by how theatrical the gesture was, as if they were acting out a scene for invisible spectators. "My client is willing to make concessions," Grayson's lawyer declared. "He'll keep the house but pay compensation." "Compensation?" Judith asked. "A tenth of the real value? That's ridiculous." After the hearing, Grayson caught up with Alice in the hallway. "You do realize I can make your life very difficult, don't you? I have connections, a reputation." "Threats will only make your situation worse," Alice replied calmly. The next day, the tax authorities came to the studio. Grayson was clearly hoping to find some irregularities, but Alice's impeccable accounting gave him no such opportunity. Then he tried to put pressure on her through mutual acquaintances. Friends called, urging Alice to settle. Some openly hinted that she was to blame, that she had become too absorbed in her work and neglected her family. Wendy unexpectedly showed up at the studio. Alice was just finishing her class when she walked in, confident with her hair and makeup perfect. "I came to talk," she began. "Grayson really loves me. Everything that happened in India was just a failed attempt to make the breakup less painful for everyone." Alice silently pointed to the door. The court hearings dragged on one after another. Grayson would agree to a compromise, then make absurd demands again. His lawyer would bring in new documents that needed to be reviewed. "He's stalling," Judith explained. "He's hoping to wear you down, to make you agree to his terms." But Grayson miscalculated. Each attempt to pressure her only strengthened Alice's resolve to see the case through to the end. She methodically gathered documents, wrote down all his threats, and recorded every instance of pressure. The final blow came unexpectedly. Linda, the woman who had told Alice about Grayson's previous attempt to pull off a similar scheme, agreed to give official testimony. The story of deliberately leaving his wife in a foreign country without money or documents took a completely different turn. Grayson looked truly frightened for the first time when his lawyer reviewed the new case materials. The divorce proceedings ended unexpectedly quickly. After Linda's testimony, Grayson's lawyer offered to settle on Alice's terms. The house was appraised and sold, and the money was divided equally. Grayson paid compensation for the India affair and all legal costs. Alice returned to her small rented apartment as an officially free woman. The next morning, she opened her studio as usual. She turned on the lights, spread out the rugs, and lit incense. Her familiar routine helped her return to normal life. Gradually, her circle of students began to rebuild. Some returned, apologizing for their temporary absence. New ones appeared, mostly on the recommendation of regular clients. Maggie stayed on at the studio, and now they made the schedule together, complementing each other well. Alice developed a new program of classes. In addition to the usual practices, she included relaxation and stress management techniques. Her personal experience proved unexpectedly useful. She understood her students better when they were going through difficult periods in their lives. Rachel helped her find a nice apartment not far from the studio. Alice didn't want to buy a new home right after selling her house. She decided to rent an apartment first to figure out what she really wanted. She redecorated the studio. Now it was completely her space, and she could change it to suit her taste. The new pastel colors on the walls, the live plants, and the convenient shelves for rugs and blankets all created an atmosphere of calm and comfort. One morning, while teaching a class, Alice realized that for the first time in a long time, she felt truly at peace. There was no need to analyze every word and action, watch the reactions of those around her, justify herself, or prove anything. Judith, who had become almost a friend during the process, advised her to invest the money from the sale of the house in expanding her business. Alice began looking for a space for a second studio in a neighboring area. Now that she didn't have to agree on every decision with Grayson, she was free to plan her future. Maggie suggested organizing yoga retreats. The idea proved successful. There were many people who wanted to spend a weekend outside the city in the company of like-minded people. The first retreat was held at a small country hotel and attracted 20 participants. In the evenings, Alice began to spend more time with her friends. She was learning to build her life again, but now it was her conscious decision, not an attempt to live up to someone else's expectations. The studio's finances took off. Corporate clients appeared. Several companies booked regular classes for their employees. Alice hired another teacher, a young woman who had recently received her certification. Grayson no longer appeared in her life. Through mutual acquaintances, Alice learned that he had moved to another city. Wendy was not with him. However, it didn't matter anymore. The past was in the past. By the end of autumn, Alice had finally settled into a new rhythm of life. Morning classes, business meetings, evenings with friends or alone, everything had fallen into place. She no longer felt like a victim of circumstances. Now, it was her life, her decisions, her path. The studio was noisy and crowded again. Students came and went, sharing their stories, finding support and understanding. Alice felt that she was finally doing what she was meant to do, helping people find balance, and not just physical balance. On a cold winter evening, Alice was sorting through old documents. Among the papers were photographs, postcards, and notes, evidence of a past life. In one of the pictures, she and Grayson were standing in front of their newly purchased house. Alice remembered that day. They were so excited, full of plans. She took out her diary from 3 years ago. Her habit of recording events and thoughts now allowed her to trace how Grayson's behavior had gradually changed. Here was the first entry about his sudden business trip when he canceled their anniversary. At the time, Alice was upset, but she accepted his explanation. Business meetings became more frequent. Grayson talked about new contracts and promising clients. Now Alice understood that he was creating an image of a successful businessman, preparing the ground for future manipulation. Her diary entries mentioned his strange phone calls. Alice remembered how she had convinced herself that they were just work calls. Even when he started going into another room to talk, she found excuses for it. His sudden interest in her work was also a worrying sign. Grayson had never been particularly involved in the studio's affairs, but then he suddenly started offering ideas for development, asking about income, and making plans for expansion. Alice remembered how he had insisted on a joint bank account. He explained it as convenience, trust, family values, and she didn't even think about why a man who had always been so scrupulous about finances suddenly wanted to merge accounts. In old messages, she found correspondence with a friend where she talked about his new hobby, expensive suits, and a change of perfume. Classic signs of infidelity that she stubbornly refused to notice. The story with India now looked completely different. His persistent offers to study abroad, stories about important negotiations, sudden concern for her professional growth. It was all part of the plan. Alice found an advertising brochure for the ashram where Grayson had been so eager to send her. Beautiful photos, inspiring descriptions, promises of spiritual growth. He knew exactly which buttons to push. Among the papers, she found a stack of restaurant bills. Grayson often brought them home, claiming they were business expenses. Now Alice saw the pattern. All these restaurants were in the same neighborhood, not far from the clinic where Wendy worked. Old bank statements showed how Grayson had been gradually preparing for his plan. Small cash withdrawals, purchases that he explained as necessary for work. He was slowly but surely withdrawing money. Alice remembered her friends' reactions to their relationship. Many had noticed strange behavior in Grayson, but she had always defended him, found explanations, and convinced everyone that they had a perfect marriage. Photos from their last vacation together showed how much he had changed. A distant look, a forced smile, a clear desire to get home as soon as possible. By that time, he was clearly living a different life. In his notebook, she found a guest list from their last party. Alice remembered how Grayson had insisted on this event. Now she understood. It was a farewell, a beautiful final chord to their life together. It was interesting to trace how his vocabulary had changed, from sincere "I love you" and "I miss you" to formal "we need to talk" and "let's decide." His body language had changed too, fewer hugs, more distance. Looking back on the past, Alice felt no bitterness or anger. It had been a valuable experience that showed how easy it was to be deceived when you really wanted to believe in the best, and how important it was to trust your intuition, even if your mind found excuses for everything. Spring in New York was surprisingly warm. Alice opened the windows in her new studio, letting in fresh air and sunlight. The second yoga studio, opened in a respectable neighborhood of Manhattan, turned out to be a good decision. It attracted a completely different crowd than her first studio. The morning group was already leaving when Maggie came in with some papers. They were planning a series of outdoor summer workshops, a new format that had been unexpectedly successful. In her office, Alice was looking through business correspondence. A proposal for cooperation had arrived from a large chain of sports clubs. They wanted to include her signature program in their schedule. She needed to think about the terms of the contract. After lunch, she met with a real estate agent. The apartment Alice had her eye on was in an old building with high ceilings and large windows. The neighborhood was quiet and within walking distance of both studios. In the evening, Rachel stopped by and they agreed to have dinner together. Her friend shared news from the publishing house and told her about the manuscript she was working on. They discussed their plans for the summer and talked about their upcoming trip to Europe. Life had changed over the past year, but it hadn't gotten better or worse. It had simply become different. Alice no longer tried to live up to anyone's expectations or put on a facade of a perfect relationship. Her decisions now depended solely on her. Things were going well. Both studios were running smoothly and had built up a reliable circle of regular clients. Alice enjoyed developing her business, trying new formats and training novice teachers. The story with Grayson was in the past. Sometimes she heard news about him through mutual acquaintances. He had moved to Chicago and was trying to start a new business. But this information no longer evoked any emotions. In the evenings, Alice loved to walk around the city discovering new places. She met interesting people and found new hobbies. Life consisted of many little things: morning coffee at her favorite coffee shop, painting classes on weekends, meeting friends, planning new projects. She had time for herself in her schedule. She could afford to just sit in the park with a book or go out of town for the weekend. She no longer had to adjust to someone else's schedule or justify her desires. The studios demanded a lot of attention, but now it was a pleasant activity. Alice enjoyed creating a space where people could find peace and balance. Her personal experience helped her better understand those who came to her classes in search of support. Judith, with whom she remained friends, sometimes dropped in for morning classes. They would meet for lunch and discuss the legal aspects of expanding the business. The story with Grayson taught Alice to be more careful with documents and contracts. The new apartment was bright and spacious. Alice furnished it to her own taste, without regard for anyone else's preferences. It was cozy to work there in the evenings, planning new projects and thinking about ideas for developing the studios. She often spent her weekends with friends or new acquaintances. Alice learned to appreciate simple pleasures, long conversations, dinners together, spontaneous walks around the city. She no longer made grandiose plans for the future, preferring to live in the moment. New traditions appeared in her life: Saturday classes in the park, Sunday brunches with friends, evening walks along the embankment. It was a calm, fulfilling life, where every day brought something new.